Bom dia. You need it for the translator. Can you hear me without? Can you hear me? No. You need this. Okay. Great. So Professor Nelson has outlined to you the study that we completed in Romania. And what I want to do is give you very briefly some of the research findings that we have from that study. Just to review, as Professor Nelson told you, the study design was to take young children from 6 different institutions that were living in Bucharest, Romania, to study them while they were living in the institutions, and then to randomize them, take half of them and place them with foster care families, that's FCG is foster care group, and leave the other half living in the institutions where we found them. So we did not randomize infants or children to live in the institution. They were living in the institutions at the time. And what we also did is we recruited a group of young children that were living in the community and who had never had a history of institutionalization. They'd grown up with their biological parents. As Professor Nelson mentioned, we have a long list of areas that we were interested in looking at, and I'm only going to touch on 2 or 3 of those areas this morning, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of these areas should you have questions at the end. As Professor Nelson said, we had 3 different hypotheses, and it's very important that I explain these questions to you. These are our research or scientific questions. The first is we believed that living in an institution, growing up in an institution, would have a profound effect upon a child's development across all of the domains that we were going to assess. The second thing that we predicted is that if we took a child out of an institution and we placed them into a foster family, that would help. It would remediate some of the effects of these deficits that we would find when we first assessed the children. Excuse me. And the third hypothesis, which is one of the more important ones for our study, not all of the infants in our study were the same age when we began. Not all of the infants in our study were the same age when they were placed into foster care. And so what we were able to do with that information is we were able to see whether or not the age at which the child was taken out and placed into a family mattered for the intervention. Was the intervention more powerful depending upon the age at which the child was taken out? Okay, so let me go first to the first domain that I want to describe, and that is IQ. How many here know what IQ is? Yes, raise your hands. If you do, you're nodding your heads. Good. It's a measure of intelligence, cognitive development. Okay? We used a measure, since we were starting with infants, we used a measure to assess the babies and the young children called the Bailey Scales of Mental Development. This is a standard measure. It had been translated into Romanian, and it was normed for a typical Romanian population. The mean, the average IQ score on the Bailey for a typical child is 100. And the range for typical children is between 85 and 115. So, the first question that we ask is, when we went into the institution and we assessed the children, what did they look like? Whoops, I went the wrong way. There we go. Okay, the green bar, those are the children that come from the community that were raised with their biological families and that had no history of institutionalization. And what you can see there is that they have a mean score, a mean IQ score of 100. Exactly what you would expect for a typical child. But look at the red bar. The red bar are the infants and young children who were at that time living in the institution. It's 64. It's not anywhere near what the typical child would score for that age. In fact, it is so low that it is reflective of significant and severe developmental delay. So that's what we found when we first investigated those infants and children that were living in the institution. Now, remember my second question. My second question is, were these effects remediated, helped, if we took children out of the institution? So here's the answer to that second question. You can see that I'm looking at the IQ at 30 months, at 42 months, and at 54 months. The red bar are the children that were taken out of the institution and placed into foster care. The yellow bar are the children that remained in the institution. They were randomized to remain in the institution. And what you can see is that at each of these ages, the IQ scores of the infants and young children who were taken out and placed into families were higher than the children that remained in the institutions when we followed them up. So the answer to my second question is yes, our intervention worked. But I have one other question, right? And my one other question is, what's the effect of timing of taking the child out, of the age at which I take the child out of the institution? And here's the answer to that. What you can see here is I've blocked the ages of when we took the children out. On the bottom, you can see if a child was taken out below 18 months of age, between 18 to 24 months of age, between 24 to 30 months of age, or older than 30 months of age. And what should be clear to you is that if a child was taken out of the institution before 24 months, their IQ scores were normal. But if they were taken out after 24 months, then you can see that there was a significant drop in their IQ scores. Much, much lower. In fact, they were very similar to the children who remained in the institution. So I've answered my three questions. One, living in an institution has a significant effect and leads to deficits in IQ. Two, taking a child out and placing them into a family increases or fixes, remediates those deficits. And three, if you take a child out early, before 24 months of age, you have a better chance of fixing or remediating those institutional deficits. Okay. My second area is the area of attachment. Now, as Professor Nelson mentioned, there's a long history of research on the effects of institutionalization on children. In fact, there was a very famous British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst by the name of John Bowlby, who worked on the problem of institutionalization before World War II. And he was commissioned by the United Nations, by the World Health Organization, after World War II, to write a white paper on the effects of institutionalization on infants and young children. Bowlby noticed that one of the problems that children had who were living in institutions is their lack of ability to attach, to bond with a caregiver, with an adult. In fact, what he found is that sometimes he would walk into an institution and children would run up to him, hug him, and even go off with him. And typical children would not usually do that. They would be more hesitant. And so Bowlby argued that one of the things that happens to institutionalize infants and children is that they have problems in forming a relationship with a caregiver, with another adult. So we decided that we were going to assess that aspect of a child's behavior. The way we do that is there's a particular assessment in which we look at the child with the caregiver, with their favorite caregiver, and with an unfamiliar adult, and we see whether or not the child seeks the comfort and attention and security of their favorite caregiver. When we did that for the infants, remember now I have my 3 questions, right? What's the effect of institutionalization? Does our intervention work? And is there an effect of timing? So, when we looked while the infants were still living in the institution, here's what we found. If you look at the institutional group, you'll see that a large majority of them, 65%, show what the attachment research literature says is a very disorganized pattern of attachment, compared to only 20% of the community sample. But what was interesting about this is we had videotaped this paradigm with the caregivers, and we sent it to people who were experts in terms of coding attachment. And they sent us an email back, and they said, look, we code these videotapes of children from all over the world, but we've never seen behavior like this before. So we don't think that these classifications are really the way we should approach this. What we think we should do is we should do this continuum. We should score any child that has a recognizable pattern of attachment as having a 5. Right up here you can see. And 1 through 4, these are patterns of attachment that are very, very abnormal. So then we sorted the data, and here's what we found. What you can see here is that 100% of the children in the community sample have clearly recognizable patterns of attachment, but 3%, only 3% of the children living in the institutions did. So to answer my first question, living in an institution means that your attachment behavior is quite abnormal. Second question, is there an effect of the intervention? When we look at that, we find that the answer is yes. Those children who were taken out of the institution and placed into foster care, about 50-50 of them are showing normal patterns of attachment, whereas in the institutional sample, the large majority of them are being insecure. So the answer is yes, we do have an intervention effect. And my third question, timing, right? So let's look at timing. Oops, let me go back. And what you can see here is that, again, yes, if you are a foster care child taken out now before 22 months of age, you're much more likely to have a secure attachment. In fact, that same pattern that I showed you with IQ is true for attachment. A child that's taken out of the institution before 24 months of age is much more likely to have a normal attachment to a caregiver than a child that's taken out after 24 months of age. Okay. I have two more pieces of data, and then I'll end for questions. One of the things that we were interested in at age 12 is to see whether or not a child was showing competent behavior, and we called competent behavior in all of these domains: physical health, mental health, academic performance, family and peer relationships, whether or not they were engaged in risky behavior. And if we look at the distribution, we can see that there's a distribution of all these competent behaviors. But now, if we use the analysis of intent to treat that Professor Nelson mentioned to you, what we see here is about 50% of the foster care children at age 12 are showing competent behavior, but only 22% of the children that were originally randomized to the institution at age 12, that's 10 years later, are showing competent behavior. And in fact, if we look at timing here, which is my third question, what we find that if you're placed before 20 months of age, you're more competent than if you're placed after 20 months of age. So the earlier you're taken out of the institution, 10 years later now, the more competent you are in your behavior. Okay, one of the things that Professor Nelson mentioned is that we studied brain behavior. We put these little caps on the children, and we measured the electrical activity that comes off of their heads. Here's what we found. First question, when we looked at the children when they were living in the institution. The only thing you have to remember here is that the brain should be producing electrical energy. That's the normal thing. And if you look at these maps, these figures, red means I'm producing positive electrical brain activity. And what you can see here is all the community children are producing positive brain activity, but none of the institutional children are. So it's as if you took a dimmer switch and you turned down the brain activity of a child that's living in an institution. Now, here's what we found as we follow the children up in terms of both timing and intervention. What you can see here, these are the community children, and you can see they're showing the pattern of high brain activity. Here are the children from the foster care group taken out before 2 years of age. There's no difference between these two groups. Here are the children who are randomized to remain in the institution, and here are the children who were taken out after 24 months of age. So in terms of the intervention, yes, it worked, but it really worked for those children who were taken out before 2 years of age for normalizing brain activity. Okay, I'm going to skip these and go to my last area, which is stress. And the reason I want to tell you about stress, we all experience stress, yes? But we know that disruption of stress can affect development. And in fact, we also know that having a caregiver, having an attachment to a caregiver, can reduce stress in an infant and young child. So we were very interested in seeing what the stress response was of the children in our study. In order to do that, we did a number of things, but we measured their heart rate, their blood pressure, and we also had them spit into a test tube, and we collected that saliva and analyzed it for a hormone called cortisol which allows us to measure the amount of stress that's going on. And here's what we found. Well, let me tell you about this. This is the way researchers induce stress in their subjects. We had the children sit in a room, and we told them that each one of them was supposed to get up and give a speech. And the speech was why they should be liked by all the other children. We had investigators sitting in the room with them with white lab coats, taking notes, and telling them that they were doing a terrible job. So that induces a lot of stress in anyone, in an adult and in a child. And we measured their heart rate and their cortisol during the speech, during the preparation of the speech, during the speech, and after the speech. So here's what we found when we looked at heart rate. We found that the community sample, that's the never institutionalized group, showed an elevation in heart rate. They got stressed out. Our foster care group was sort of in the middle, but if you look at the children who were randomized to the institution, they're not getting stressed out at all. In fact, they have what we call a blunted stress response. If we look at sympathetic activity, that is how fast the heart is beating with, in terms of the noradrenaline, what we find is that the community children are showing good noradrenaline responses, a good stress response. The foster care children are right in the middle, and the care as usual, the institutionalized children are not showing a response at all. Now we look at cortisol reactivity. And what you see here is what you would expect to be a typical pattern of cortisol reactivity. During the speech, cortisol goes up, and after the speech, cortisol goes down. That's what happens with a typical child. But you see here that both for the foster care children and for the institutionalized children, it's almost a flat line. Everybody see that? But wait, what's my third question? My third question is, what about timing? So we asked the question, does timing, does the age at which you take the child out of the institution matter? And the answer is, yes, it does. Here's the cortisol response of the children that were taken out before 24 months of age. It looks just like a typical child. In fact, I'll go backwards just for a second, right? The black line there, those are the typical children from the community. The black line here, those are the children who were taken out and placed into foster care before 24 months of age. They're the same. They're showing a good stress response. But if you're taken out after 24 months of age, you're not showing a stress response at all, very much like the children in the institution. Okay, so as Professor Nelson told you, we have multiple domains. All of them have their different sensitive periods. But what we have found are three things. One, well, let me say, why do these timing placements, why do we think that timing matters? Here's the answer. What is not happening to a child who's living in an institution? They are suffering from having multiple rotation of caregivers. They are suffering from not having stimulation and interaction. And they are suffering from not having holding, lack of response to distress, lack of reciprocal interaction, lack of paying attention. Now, the institutions in Romania come from a terrible history, as Professor Nelson told you, Ceausescu. But an institution is an institution. And although we are very well-meaning in terms of trying to give the best care that we can to infants and young children, that kind of congregate care still results in children, infants and children, not getting the individualized attention that they need. So some of our effects show timing and some didn't, and we're currently looking at our data this way. So what are our conclusions? The first is, number one, children living in institutions have deficits in their cognitive abilities, in their emotional abilities, in their stress responsibilities. Taking out a child and placing them into foster care with our intervention remediates, fixes some of these deficits, and timing of placement is very important in terms of fixing these deficits of children who have a history of living in institutions. So these are, you've heard from Professor Nelson. Charles Zena is our third colleague who is a child psychiatrist at Tulane University. We have gotten funding over these years from a number of different organizations that have allowed us to continue to follow these children. We're now seeing them when they're age 16. And I'll stop there, and perhaps both Professor Nelson and I can answer your question. Thank you.